think that, the whole point of the exercise is to get the students to see that there's a whole bunch of stuff that we take for granted that doesn't quite fit the scientific materialist worldview. So sometimes the easier examples are moral examples. Like if I say it's wrong to torture children for fun, and I said, how many of you think that's a correct statement? It's wrong. And everybody raises their hand, right? Well, how do you prove that?
Have you? Okay, right? I have to ask. Have you ever had a smart aleck student? Have you ever had?
I've had many. Well, about 25 years ago, I had a student in class who asked me why I thought that she said, "Why is the truth important?" And I asked her, "Do you want the true answer or the false one?" And so, and that was the point of that was to say that sometimes the answer isn't the result of an argument; it's actually the starting point of an argument.
Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Francis J. Beckwith. He is a philosopher who publishes and teaches in the areas of religion, jurisprudence, politics, and ethics. He's the professor of philosophy and church-state studies at Baylor University, where he also serves as associate director of the graduate program in philosophy and affiliate professor of political science. Dr. Beckwith, wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
And so today we are going to talk about how religious beliefs should be properly used in the public square, especially in the arenas of legal and judicial purposes. And that's working off your book, Taking Right Seriously, which, fair warning, is really good, but also very heavy. So it's not line by line argumentation, but I'd say it's paragraph by paragraph. And I think you do a really good job of walking through, that's, for our listeners, but walking through and just making your points clearly and definitively. So how did you get interested in this topic to begin with?
Well, it's a long story. I began being interested in legal questions concerning religion right after graduate school. So I did my doctorate at Fordham University in New York City, late 80s, graduated in 1989, and I'd done most of my work in graduate school in the area of philosophy of religion. My doctoral dissertation was on David Hume's argument against miracles. I had an interest in faith and reason questions from the very early days of my time in school. When I was in elementary school, I was always asking questions about God and morality. I was a kind of annoying kid in Catholic school, and it sort of gravitated to that academically. Well, right after graduating from Fordham, I was hired at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where I grew up. I grew up in Vegas. And so it was great to be back home, to be able to teach at the local university. And the chairman of the philosophy department asked if I'd begin teaching courses in political and legal philosophy and ethics. I had some interest in that, but not a lot. And so I began teaching in that area, and that I began encountering, especially on controversial questions, what I thought were deficits in the way in which people assessed the claims of religious citizens. And so that led me to think about issues that sort of the big, especially the abortion question. That was the first one that I began thinking about, published some early work in that area in academic journals. And then in the late 90s, decided to go to law school. And I went to Washington University in St. Louis. And in those days, they had a graduate degree program in law called a Master of Juridical Studies. And it was no longer offered anymore, but it was a special degree for people that were scholars in other fields that were interested in the law but didn't want to practice.
What a cool idea.
So I went to, so I went to WashU, took virtually all the first year law courses that everyone takes, and then some electives. And I had to write a dissertation as part of the degree, which is not what typical law students do. And it was on the debate about teaching intelligent design in public schools. And it was a topic that interested me because it kind of dovetailed all my interests. There was philosophy of religion, constitutional law, philosophy of science, politics and religion. And the issue kind of had all of these in one. And so I published this book as a result of the dissertation called Law, Darwinism, and Public Education. And I parceled out portions of the dissertation as law review articles. And it was soon after that I was hired by Baylor to be the associate director of their Church State Studies Institute. And then a couple of years after that, moved to the philosophy department, which is my more natural discipline.
Yeah.
So those are the things that kind of drew me to these questions. And as I say in Taking Right Seriously, I've kind of changed my mind about a few things. So when I first began having an interest in the intelligent design debate, I would say that I was very sympathetic to intelligent design as a view. I've kind of drifted away from that. I don't agree with the view anymore. I thought that I really ever agreed with it, but I just thought it was one of those tantalizing theories that kind of broke the mold. And so it was mostly defended by people that were overtly religious, but it was a view that was defended by secular reasons. So it didn't kind of fit the idea of advancing religious views. But over the years, as I began thinking about the intelligent design as a view itself, I became more skeptical about it. And so in Taking Right Seriously, I have a whole chapter explaining why I've grown more negative about the view as a view. That's different from the legal question.
Right.
And I make that distinction in the book.
Yeah. So a couple of questions that come out of that. First one, can you tell me a little bit more about the Church State Institute? What is that?
Oh, okay. So Baylor started way back in the 1950s, the Church State Studies Institute. It was eventually named after one of its most famous alumni, Joseph Martin Dawson, or J.M. Dawson. And so it was called the J.M. Dawson Institute of Church State Studies. It started originally as a kind of think tank, a place where professors at the university who teach in other departments can sort of publish their works, maybe sponsor conferences and things of that sort. And then eventually I think in the 60s and 70s, maybe in the 70s, I'm not a historian of the Institute.
Right.
There was a master's degree program offered. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, they began offering a doctoral program. And the Institute still exists, but about 7-8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, the university decided to end the degree programs, mostly because Baylor began offering doctoral programs in political science, philosophy, sociology. And so what eventually happened is a lot of those students that would have applied to the Church State Studies Institute began, for strategic career reasons, to gravitate towards the more conventional disciplines. And so I moved to philosophy, which is a better fit for me, given my own interests. But so that's the story of the Institute. It still exists. It still publishes the Journal of Church State Studies, which is a very important journal in the area of law and religion.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Sorry, I didn't have any categories for how that fits, so that definitely stuck out to me. So just starting kind of in that introductory chapter, for our listeners, can you talk through your critique of scientific materialism and how that affects our perception of religious knowledge and beliefs?
Yeah, so imagine, actually, I'll tell the story.
Sure.
The beginning of the book, I tell the story of speaking at Texas Tech University. I was invited by law school to actually talk about my book on Darwinism and public education. And the purpose of the talk was to simply talk about the legal questions. And there was a gentleman in the audience who raised his hand at the end, and he said, "All you've given us are religious arguments," which technically wasn't true. I was actually giving legal arguments, but he was from one of the science departments, and he rightfully, I think, was skeptical of some of the arguments for intelligent design. So I don't disagree with that. But I immediately answered and said, actually paused for a moment and collected my thoughts, and I said, "Oh, I thought you were going to say they were bad arguments."
Right.
I'm relieved. I thought you were going to. And so there was actually a moment where I realized that in many ways, the way in which people deal with arguments that are sort of motivated by religion is to sort of categorize them as sort of outside the realm of reason.
Yeah.
And the audience laughed, and we actually wound up talking for quite a while afterwards. He was there with some friends, and he said, "Well, what did you mean by that?" I said, "Well, look, arguments are either sound or unsound. Labeling them religious in and of itself doesn't tell you about the quality of the argument."
Right.
And so there was a kind of smuggling in of this idea that the only arguments that or points of view that are legitimate are those that can be tightly tethered to a kind of scientific materialism. And what I was suggesting was that you don't get to win that easy,
right,
by just simply redefining what counts as legitimate discourse. Having said that, though, I mean, clearly I have a burden as well, right? I mean, I have to show that, in fact, if I hold to views that challenge his, I obviously have some obligation to give him reasons why I hold the views that I do.
Yeah.
But I don't think this way of thinking on his part, doesn't adequately account for why people hold views that may very well seem kind of weird or odd, given the dominance of a kind of scientific materialism in the academy.
They should be taken at the value of their judgments, not just how they're characterized.
Yes. So, an example I've used in class, and it's one that, I don't think it proves my position, but it shows why people, at least philosophers, are sort of interested in these questions. So I asked my students, what is mathematics? What is it? I mean, when we talk about things like, let's say, computers and lamps and dogs and cats, we can sort of talk about what are these things, right? And we can talk about artifacts and natural objects and organisms, but abstract objects are really difficult to figure out what they are, right? I mean, in a sense, they're not anywhere, and yet in some sense they're more real, right? So if I say, let's say circumference equals 2 pi radius, right? Or I know what triangularity is. It's really not, I mean, I can't really find in the physical world a perfect triangle.
Right.
Right. And yet I kind of know what it is. So if the physical world ceased to exist, would it still be necessarily true that circumference equals 2 pi radius?
Yeah, and it's just always and universally true. And on the other side, we want to say these things that we hold and that we see, like lamps and stuff like that, are more real, right? And your what you said was that the abstract might be more real, but you look at something like a mug, and if you have a big, deep mug, sometimes it turns into a bowl, right? And you're like, wait, what is this thing? And I think I know what it is. And then, but you can't argue 2 + 2 = 4, right? Like you can't. But anyways,
that's right. So I mean, I think that the whole point of the exercise is to get the students to see that there's this whole bunch of stuff that we take for granted that doesn't quite fit the scientific materialist worldview.
Mm.
So sometimes the easier examples are moral examples. Like if I say it's wrong to torture children for fun, and I said, how many of you think that's a correct statement? It's wrong. And everybody raises their hand, right? Well, how do you prove that?
Have you? Okay,
right? I mean,
I have to ask. Have you ever had a smart aleck student? Have you ever had?
I've had many. Well, about 25 years ago, I had a student in class who asked me why I thought that she said, "Why is the truth important?" And I asked her, "Do you want the true answer or the false one?" And so, and that was the point of that was to say that sometimes the answer isn't the result of an argument; it's actually the starting point of an argument. That is, it's something you presuppose. And you sort of can't live without.
Like torturing children for fun, right? Like,
yeah. I mean,
the way I just said that, after you said things you can't live without, didn't quite fit. Let me play to that. Not torturing children for fun is something that I like. Yeah, that I have to have that as a fundamental.
Yeah, and so I do think these are the sorts of things that animate people. Who've animated people for generations, right? Why people become philosophy majors, right? Or why is it that Plato and Aristotle were kind of dumbfounded by what seems to be things that we know that just aren't directly accessible through our senses, right? So, a question I actually asked my students yesterday in class. We just going over. We just completed a discussion of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, where he makes a case for civil disobedience. And I asked my students, what do you think is more important, the physical world or the non-physical? And they automatically go to the physical world. And I said, okay, would you rather have your arm broken or your heart? And nobody picked the heart. They all picked, they'd rather have their arm broken. And so I said, doesn't that show you that there is, something about you as a human being that is far more important than, what is physically apparent? Doesn't mean that the physical world is unimportant. Clearly it is.
Right.
I mean, we have to live and survive and eat and drink and so forth. But there is something about us. And King recognizes this when he talks about laws that undermine human personality. Right? He's just not, he doesn't think that the success of the civil rights movement is contingent upon African American citizens just having their physical needs met. It's also what needs to be addressed is how they're treated as fellow citizens, right? The dignity and respect that they're entitled to. And so this is why, I raised this point in class, is that going to work is not just merely about doing something to make money. It's also having a kind of fulfillment. So, obviously, it is about people do work to help provide for themselves and their families, but there's also this sense of inner fulfillment that is more than just getting that financial reward.
Right.
And so there's more to us than just, meeting our physical needs.
Yeah. And I mean, and there are different conceptions of what that might be, and we have to figure out a way to find common ground. But I think that's really a big part of what my own philosophical study. I got a master's in philosophy of religion from Trinity in Chicago. But the
Deerfield?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I taught for Trinity in the 90s.
Oh, awesome. Very cool.
Yeah, the Southern California campus. And I used to fly. One semester, I don't know, probably before your time, there was a professor named Paul Feinberg.
Yes.
Who he retired. He passed away, I think, about a decade ago. But Paul was on research leave. And so I flew in. They had me fly in every Monday night. And I taught every other. I drive to LAX, fly into Chicago on a red eye, take a sleep for like 6 or 7 hours and teach in the afternoon.
I'm tired just hearing it. Yeah, no, that's crazy.
So I was a lot younger then, and I could do that. And I taught. I taught a graduate seminar in modern philosophy.
Oh, that's awesome.
So we went from I think Descartes through Kant.
Yeah.
So that was my yeah. So I was a faculty member there, but I lived in California and did most of my teaching there at the extension campus.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I actually studied under John Feinberg because he was
I know
the
John,
yeah.
yeah,
Um,
and Harold Netland too. Is he?
yes, yeah. I took classes with him, and then with Dr. Yandel, who yeah.
Oh, okay.
But so anyways, like my study was in hermeneutics, and really a lot of what I've focused on is how surprising it is to me um, to find truth in different places and in different ways of knowing, different modes of knowing. So I found that those parts especially interesting to me when you're talking about like religion as a source of knowledge, right? For me,
Hmm.
that's largely been focused on art, but also recognizing that sort of thing. Do you see what is the value of religion as a source of knowledge? How would you? What do you think is the appropriate way to appropriate that for just as a not at a knowledge level, and then obviously, all throughout we're talking about how we take that knowledge and use it in the common way.
Yeah, that's a very big question. I
Yes,
mean,
it
there are
is.
I mean, there's lots of religions,
Mm,
and there are a lot of faith traditions. So you know, I I think that I mean the way that I think I've changed on this question to a certain extent. When I was in my early 20s, late 20s, I was deeply influenced by a way of thinking about faith and reason that had been connected to a evangelical theologian named John Warwick Montgomery. I don't know if you know, have heard of Montgomery.
I
Montgomery was actually
go ahead.
Montgomery was a professor of mine, and he had this very kind of empirically oriented way of looking at Christian faith. He would say, so the kind of scientific materialist would say, you need to prove everything through, scientific and historical arguments, and Montgomery would say, well, we can do that,
Yes.
right? And so his answer to that wasn't to challenge the assumptions of scientific materialism, but to simply say we can meet that challenge. And this was something that was part of kind of, you think of early American kind of evangelical thinking was deeply influenced by a Scottish common sense
Mm,
philosophy, Thomas Reid and others, which was kind of the way that most early Americans thought, going all the way back to the American founding. And so if you go back and read people like, let's say, B.B. Warfield and J. Gresham Machen and these guys, they tend to accept that way of looking at things. Now, Montgomery is a kind of extreme example. He just, basically uh, wasn't at all sympathetic to pietism, or he would call pietism. But ironically, Montgomery was also very much drawn to people like Tolkien and Lewis and fiction writers. And
mm,
I always wondered whether that was kind of his way of expressing that part of us, that artistic part of us that can't be cabined by
right.
that rationalism. So, but as I've gotten older, and my reading has expanded, I became more and more influenced by certain Catholic thinkers.
Mm,
In fact, wind up returning to the Catholic Church. I'd grown up Catholic, left, and then returned 15 years ago. The work of Thomas
mm,
Aquinas influenced me, and one of the things Aquinas talks about is what we can know as a consequence of our reason about God, and what we can know only as a result of special revelation. So uh, we can know certain things, says Aquinas, uh, in terms of, here I'm talking within the Christian tradition.
sure.
I will say a few things about mystical experience, which can be had obviously by people of different religious traditions.
Mm,
Uh, but what Aquinas says is uh, that very few people can sort of come up with and evaluate arguments for God's existence. But most people just come to believe these things because they just seem to be right. And that's not irrational. That's just the way in which human beings respond to the world that's out there. And the kinds of things that I think, I don't think Aquinas would use this illustration, obviously, but supposing you are visiting the Grand Canyon and you look at the majestic beauty of the Grand Canyon and you just have a sense of the presence of God. To me, that is a perfectly human way to respond to beauty, right? There's something transcendent about that. They can't be reducible to, let's say, a geologist's analysis of the Grand Canyon. Imagine you walked into the Louvre and for the first time you saw in person the Mona Lisa, which I did, 21 years ago when my wife and I were in Paris. And I was actually overwhelmed by it. And I'm not an art guy. And so I just was sort of blown away at how art actually affected me. And what if one of my friends who was a chemist says, it's on nothing but canvas and paint? That would be kind of, that wouldn't be accurate. Yeah. Right? There's something more to what I'm observing. And so I do think there's a sense in which we can know things that can't be reducible to a formulation or even propositions.
Yeah, and that question's very interesting to me. Particularly, grew up evangelical, very similar to it was. I actually didn't grow up in evangelical. I grew up independent fundamental Baptist, and became evangelical, moved kind of past even that. But the to your chemist friend said that, and this was my experience as a kid reading literature and trying to piece it together with the theology and the little philosophy I was taught. I was like, well, you're not wrong, right? Like when he says it's paper and but you're not right either. And that was the experience that I continually had of like the irreducibility and how it was like we weren't capturing something, right? Like we'd had this very narrow logic. And I think that's it's really important that we account for everything. Which I think is a big part of your argument in many ways. So I even oh, go ahead. Sorry, you sounded like you had something.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think there's a lot going on when people hold beliefs, right? So there's a we seek out reasons, right, for why we believe things, but there's a kind of core sometimes of what we believe that it is almost inconceivable. We can't conceive of actually stumbling upon something that would actually show that it's wrong. So, and I'm not sure that's irrational, right? So if let's say, going back to the torturing children for fun, I'm so convinced that it's wrong to torture children for fun that, in fact, I'm more convinced of that than I am of Einstein's second theory of relativity. And so I use this example in class to tell my students, you actually are more sure of a lot of moral propositions than you are of science, even though science is presented to us as sort of the definitive avenue by which we know things.
I love absurd and graphic examples in philosophy. So that I'm sorry, it just always gets me when you say that. I think everyone's like, okay, yeah, no. And it is interesting to notice how some people in conversation will want to hurry past that because they don't even, if they're so sure of it that they don't even want to dwell on your argument because they don't want to talk about it because it bothers them so much, right? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's what the Jonathan Haidt, the moral psychologist, calls dumbfounding.
Yes.
So
I've never heard that. I love that.
So and he says the reason why it happens mostly to what he calls weird people. What he means by weird is Western, educated. I forget what the I is. Western, educated, whatever rich. Democrats. And what he means by Democrats is sort of, liberal democracy.
Yes.
It's not referring to the political party.
Oh, okay.
And so what he says is that people who have, grown up with this view of culture and society, think of the at least moral questions as being reducible to matters of kind of consent, right? So the problem is when you bring up these kind of counterexamples, right, that seem to touch on things that people believe are wrong, but since they can't be fully captured by the weird way of looking at things, that they don't know what to do. And so, I don't want to give you all, he comes up with some pretty graphic examples.
Sure.
So one is the case of the guy in Germany who puts an ad in the paper for somebody that he can cannibalize. And the guy answers the ad and he shows up and he actually goes through with it.
Wow.
And so
wait, was that real?
So it's a real case. Oh. Yeah. You can look it up. And so height, when this question is brought to the attention of college students that he's interviewing, they try to come up with some way to account. Well, he didn't really consent. Maybe he was insane, or they try to find some way to, and says, no, he was perfectly sane and he decided to do this. And
oh man.
And so what Haidt says is that the reason why people from more traditional cultures don't find it problematic to say that's wrong is they also have, they bring to bear on this not only the ideas of fairness and justice and consent, but also ideas of sacredness and dignity, that and honor, that in Western societies we tend to diminish a little bit. Not that they're part of our moral palette, but we tend to accentuate the consent and contractual aspect of our moral lives. And so by doing that, though, we sometimes play down something that's really important. Right. And so I highly recommend Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, where he talks about this in great detail and explains why we sometimes have difficulty talking to each other politically, is that we have we just have, generally liberals and conservatives have different taste buds. Or not that we have different taste buds, that we tend to accentuate some of them more than others. And so the example that I've used in class is the debate about Colin Kaepernick and his wanting to kneel before the American flag as a protest against police brutality. And so people that tend to be more conservative will see that as dishonoring the flag. Right. And so those that are more, let's say, progressive say, no, he's standing for justice. And it's not that conservatives don't believe in justice. And it's not that liberals or progressives don't believe in honoring the country, but they just put them in kind of different hierarchical order.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, conservatives see the relationship between a citizen and his nation as similar to the relationship between parents and children. That is, you don't you may criticize your parents privately, but you don't do it in public, right? Whereas progressives may see it more as like, no, it's a question of justice.
Right.
If your parents have wronged you, so it's and again, it's not a question of that either side totally rejects the principles. Yeah. It's just kind of where they place them. And so I think
it's more a question of decorum almost than it is about, that's really interesting. Sorry, do you have something you wanted to finish with? Or?
No. So it just helped me to understand why I have certain, moral reflexes, things that sort of get under my skin, like instantly. So I think one of my flaws is that I will sometimes gravitate to positions because the wrong people hold the other one or the opposite one. And so it's something I have to sort of wrestle with and sort of question myself, am I gravitating to this view because the wrong people hold the opposite view? And I think it's a temptation. I mean, I think maybe everybody has. Some people are better at resisting this than others. I kind of admire the person that can resist it. I try to be as, I try to separate myself, but it's tough, and I think part of it has to do with the idea of honor and showing respect for your friends. And I think that's generally, it's a good thing to hold, right? So I will not, let's say, publicly criticize my university, even though I may disagree with, let's say, once in a while, a thing or two said by the president. And if I have any disagreements, I'll privately make them known. I don't think, and I don't know, again, sir, friends of mine would say that's a character flaw in me, that I should, but I don't know. I think that, in terms of weighing other goods, it may be, the more prudent thing to do.
Well, and there are cultural values at play here. It's interesting to me. So my wife comes from rural Alabama, and I come from, we moved around a lot when I was a kid, but originally my whole family's kind of from New England. And so when we deal with conflict, right, it's it's like, all right, this is the problem. We're dealing with the problem. We're done. And my wife wants to like walk through the whole thing. And just because we like talked about it doesn't mean it's done. And, so there's good to being done with things and putting it behind you. And then there's also sometimes where sitting with it a little bit longer, being a little more patient is really important. And so even at the cultural and societal level, you can have values that can lean to help in one way and hurt in others.
Yeah. I mean, Victor, just this morning when I mentioned earlier the prospectus defense that I was chairing, there was a part of our discussion with the student. One of my colleagues brought up, he goes, we should have just culture war theory. So you've heard of, there's just war theory. And I just thought, that's really clever. I turned to my colleague, I said, that's an article. I think I may steal that idea.
Yeah.
So his thinking was this, that in just war theory, aggression against a adversary is only justified if the only type of response you can make is proportionate response. So, somebody attacks you, you can resist the attack or the invasion, but you can't like go to that other country and start killing innocent people because that's disproportionate. That's a kind of simple example. That's part of just war theory. But think about the way in which, let's say, somebody, says something awkwardly on Twitter and 100,000 people want the guy fired for his job.
Right.
Now that's disproportionate, right? So I thought, when my colleague brought this up, I thought that's an article right there. I mean, kind of saying maybe we should, apply just war theory to how we handle each other on social media, right. So somebody, let's say, says something like slightly off color. They didn't mean it. They just, they only have so many characters. And so they try to shorten it up and it comes across maybe a slightly offensive and the person apologizes. Okay, then proportionate, it's been resolved. We should just move on, right? On the other hand, if somebody, let's say, gets on social media and defames somebody and they apologize, maybe some kind of legal action is justified, maybe because the reputation has been harmed. So proportionate response there would be a lawsuit.
Right.
So maybe we should, kind of inculcate people in,
appropriate response to.
That's right. So just culture war theory.
Yeah. Sorry.
So a professor, let's say a professor tweets something that is critical of, let's say, trans theory or critical race theory, and 300 students call for the professor to resign or be punished. That's disproportionate, right? He's a professor or she's a professor. That's consistent with academic freedom. Voice your disagreement, and then that's it. right? I mean, so
Yeah.
proportionate response would be just voicing your disagreement and maybe having a panel discussion at the university, but it shouldn't be firing the person, right? That's disproportionate,
And
right? Given the
like if you have, for that example, you have because these arguments need to happen, right? You have someone taking an argumentative stance versus someone making personal attacks against somebody who's part of that, and then they double down on that, and then you're like, well, yeah, okay, like you didn't apologize, you like you're
yeah,
like this has nothing to do with academic freedom. You're just attacking this person,
yeah.
right? And that's where,
Yeah,
yeah,
personal attacks are different.
right.
Yeah, I mean, and even then, if somebody, so I've had a couple of, I had one tweet that I delete. I can't tell you what it was, but I deleted it within 1 second, and I'm so glad I did. It was, I shared the idea with one of my colleagues. He said that is like the greatest tweet ever, but you can't tweet it. I go, yeah, you're right, and it was a personal attack, and it was extremely funny, but I'm glad I didn't tweet it.
That is the problem
Uh,
with Twitter, right? It's so easy to
yeah.
reach so many people so
Well,
quickly. Yeah.
there was one the that I've since I delete my I haven't been on Twitter for a month. I've actually quit social media since the beginning of January because I've got a lot of work and I'm it's great. But there was during the middle of COVID, the comedian Amy Schumer sent out a tweet saying, or her publicist sent out a tweet that said that about new comedy she was doing, that she had comedy 19. And so I retweeted it and said, yeah, but she's asymptomatic. and and it got, I think, got retweeted like 10,000 times. It was like by
Oh
far
man.
my, and so that was one of those ones. Yeah, that was kind of playing. It was fun.
Right.
It was playful,
Right.
kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and that's also, and the interesting thing about social media is the way that academic statements, uh, humor for fun, and personal attacks get all kind of blended in, and there's no tone, and it's so short, right? Like I think like your example is obviously like in fun, and that's funny, like even if it
Yeah.
is a bit biting, but it's like uh it's so interesting to see how like something that's said with this specific audience in mind just travels so quickly over here and becomes something totally different. um but that's really fascinating. Before we get too far out, I did
Yes.
want to come back, and I would love to hear you kind of give a basic breakdown for our listeners of your disagreement with Steven Pinkner on human dignity, because I think that was a
Okay.
really good example of what you're talking about. Even as we talk about irreducibility, and I think most people will see your argument because most people just inherently in our culture, you want to talk about like that they agree with human dignity, right? That's kind of a bedrock of our society. So, it's I just use the word squishy and bedrock at the same time, but it's a squishy bedrock. We'll go with that. So, if you could walk me through that, I'd love that.
Sure. Yeah, so in 2008, Steven Pinker published this article in the New Republic called The Stupidity of Dignity. And by the way, Steven Pinker is a Harvard University psychologist who is a kind of public intellectual. I actually enjoy listening to him.
Mm,
He's, I probably, he's one of these thinkers that I'll tell my students, I agree with him 46% of the time. He's like not somebody I totally disagree
right.
with, but I really like people like him in the sense that he's willing to just say stuff
Yes.
and get the conversation going. And
Right.
I think society's better for having people like Steven Pinker.
Yeah.
Uh, but having said that, though, he writes this piece called The Stupidity of Dignity, and it's a critical analysis of the President's Bioethics
Mm,
Commission that had been chaired by Leon Kass. Leon Kass, recently retired professor at the University of Chicago. He's an MD who has written some really wonderful work on medical
mm,
ethics and published a couple of years ago a commentary in the book of Genesis. He's just one of these guys that is just, he gets his graduate degree in one area, but then has just got this, um, what's the right term? Incredibly ravenous intellect.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, he just loves learning, and
Some
so
people would
he
say tolerance for pain, but yes, ravenous
that's
intellect.
right. I mean, just you know, he's just hungry, and
Yeah.
and you can tell, and he's also got a way with words, and so his whole his whole thing when he was appointed by President George W. Bush was to advance the idea of human dignity as central to medical ethics,
Mm.
and it is different from the more kind of mainstream view, which is sometimes called principalism, that medical ethics is when we're engaging in medical ethical judgments, we have to appeal to four basic principles: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice.
Mm.
That's sort of central. And there's a kind of almost legalistic way of looking at medical ethics. And uh, Cass doesn't think that that is wrong necessarily, but what he's saying is that patients could actually make autonomous choices that violate human dignity.
Mm.
You know, supposing, you know, a patient walks into a doctor's office and says, you know, I just want both my arms amputated and replaced with prosthetics. Why? Because I don't think that I should have arms. And this is actually, things like this have happened,
Right.
you know,
Well,
and
it
so
goes back to the cannibal.
that's right.
Yes. Yeah.
So if let's say you just want to reduce, you know, the role of physician as a kind of technician that is there to simply meet the subjective needs of patients, rather than thinking of medicine as a profession that has a particular end to it, you know, you have to sort of resist this principalism. By the way, the term principalism comes from a book called The Principles of Biomedical Ethics that was authored by two well, actually one philosopher and one religious studies professor, Tom Beecham and James Childress, who at the University of Virginia, and Beecham was at Georgetown. And it's a highly influential book in medical ethics. I think there's a lot of good in it. I've been critical of it, as Cass has, but I do think there's many wonderful things in the book. I think that Beecham and Childress were instrumental in getting us to think about medical ethics in ways that no one had even envisioned prior to that book. But Cass,
Sorry to interrupt. I
yeah,
just wanted to make sure. What was the name of the gentleman who was appointed by George W. Bush?
oh, Leon Cass, Kass. So Pinker testified before the Bioethics Commission or committee, I forget the exact title, and apparently he and the members of the committee had a less than amiable exchange. And so it was soon after that that Pinker publishes his piece in the New Republic, and he goes after the idea of human dignity. He says it's squishy, it's subjective. We don't need dignity. All we need is autonomy.
Yeah.
That's it, you know, patient autonomy. And so in my chapter, in Taking Right Seriously, I'm critical of Pinker, and what I say is that there are many problems with reducing patient choices to mere autonomy. And one example I've already alluded to, this idea that that a patient can actually choose things that are not consistent with their own dignity.
Yeah.
Right now, you know, going all the way back to common law, patients do have the choice to reject medical treatment if they so choose, and that has to do with just a fundamental right that people have to not be assaulted.
Right.
Right. So that, but that's different from thinking of the role of the physician is simply to meet the needs or the desires of whatever a patient wants. And so one of the illustrations I use in the article is, you know, imagine if we had discovered that there was a group of let's say people that were victims of the Holocaust that actually chose it. I mean, we wouldn't think, and supposing they came to, for some bizarre reason, to believe Hitler's rhetoric about themselves, and they said, yeah, Hitler was right. And so they willingly walked to the gas chambers. I mean, we would think that that was, we wouldn't say, well, they were just exercising their autonomy. We would say that they just, their beliefs about themselves was undignified.
Mm.
Right? I mean, we may want to tell a different story and say that they maybe were brainwashed or something, but we would at some point have to come to the conclusion that people can make mistakes about their own value and worth.
Yeah.
And that medicine, whether it's psychiatry or some other specialty in medicine, has a role to try to work with people to see themselves in a better light.
Well, and forgive me for interrupting here, but it definitely brings to mind some of Foucault's point in History of Madness that, over time, what our culture looks at, like people thought Van Gogh was crazy. Now they think he's a genius, right? And so we see like he talks in terms of geniuses and how that flirts with madness. Because they see things that our culture doesn't see. But this has happened with medical stuff all the time where we're literally arguing and it's a cop-out, I think, to say, well, if someone is violating, it's like if it doesn't fit under autonomy, that's because, and it's wrong, that's because they're insane, right? And that's what ends up happening is you have people who just have mistaken beliefs, and we just want to lump that under insanity just as a way of like, we're reducing to the point where like things are spilling out of the boxes we're putting them in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's exactly, yeah, that's right. So, yeah, in a sense, I mean, I think Pinker's not entirely wrong that dignity, the idea of human dignity, can't be precisely defined. And so a point that I make in the chapter is that I don't think you can isolate human dignity from a moral tradition. So I think the idea of human dignity that sort of is generally held by thinkers, it's not a coincidence that you'll find most of the folks that embrace this idea of human dignity as central to medical ethics are either serious Jews or Christians or Muslims, or let's say secular thinkers that aren't sort of strict materialists. So someone like the late Ronald Dworkin would be among them. In Dworkin's last book, called Religion Without God, wants to distance himself from the kind of Richard Dawkins types. He himself was an atheist, but he thinks that this kind of reductionism doesn't truly capture the way our lives actually are conducted. So yeah, there's so I do think that you can't have the idea of human dignity unless it's in some way connected to a philosophical or theological tradition that is thick.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
For Christians and Jews, it's the image of God, right? If you read, for example, some medieval thinkers when they're talking about what distinguishes human beings from other creatures, it's our capacity to be rational, but that doesn't mean it in a kind of technical, kind of calculating sense. It means our ability to actually encounter the transcendent. And that's something that human beings have even when they are suffering from disabilities or even when they're not fully functioning.
Yeah.
And so I think you find this intuition in the rise of what is called disability studies, which is a new movement within philosophy and ethics. It's risen in the past decade or so, where you have philosophers, many of whom are not, let's say, religious, but are uneasy with the kind of rationalistic, autonomous approach to medical ethics, which they see as dangerous to people with disabilities, because a lot of people with disabilities can't act autonomously. Or some, it's not, obviously lots do, but some don't, right? There are people that are maybe have suffering from Alzheimer's or maybe other sorts of cognitive ailments.
Yeah.
And to think that they're sort of subhuman, there are people in disability studies say that is the logical conclusion to that kind of rationalistic view of autonomy, and we have to resist that.
Mm.
So it's interesting how in medical ethics there are what we would call strange bedfellows, right? People
Yeah.
that ordinarily wouldn't align themselves, but find themselves kind of in strange agreement with each other, right? So let's say more conventional, traditional religious believers find themselves aligned with, non-religious people who are uneasy with this kind of strong rationalism
Yeah.
in medical ethics.
Yeah, I actually had down to ask you about, like, there were two areas where you seem to have some convergence with. One, like postmodern critiques of modern secularism, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
idea, even when you talk about critical race theory, not that I just had Dr. Lewis Gordon on, and he was talking about the way that the current system often relies on numbers over oral and lived experience to hide
Mm-hmm.
certain things, right?
Yeah.
And one of the example that he gave was when he grew up in the Bronx. He had uh, several, like, his family members told him all the time about their encounters with police brutality. But when he looked at the numbers, they were shockingly low. But of course, the numbers were based on conviction, not on reports, and they were
Yeah.
determined by the police. That doesn't necessarily mean that it means one is right over the other, but it certainly, like, it calls into question, like, when the police are doing the reporting on themselves, right? Like, but we
Yeah.
want to put those numbers over oral and lived experience. And so it
I,
reminds me kind of what you're talking about. Go ahead.
yeah, I think that's a great point. It's something that I grew up. I was born in Brooklyn.
Mm,
I didn't grow up there. My parents moved to Las Vegas when I was a kid, but my mom's family is from Sicily and Naples,
mm,
and my two great grandfathers on my mother's side, actually all four great grandparents were immigrants, and her father was as well. He was born in Naples, but we heard stories. My great aunts and uncles would talk about the kind of discrimination that Italian Americans faced. One of my great grandfathers was actually shot in the back by police
wow.
in 1920, and I have the death certificate that actually says it on it. And I've been, you know, tempted in a good way to kind of investigate it, like what's the report look like.
Right. Right.
And I had heard this from my grandmother and didn't realize. I mean, I didn't know whether she was right or not. I mean,
Yeah.
there was no reason for her to die, but and sure enough, when I was doing genealogical research on my family, it was there.
Hmm.
And so I wonder what happened. And it just said that he was a peddler. I don't know, technically I don't know what that meant, right?
Right.
Maybe he was, but apparently, my vision is he was accused of stealing something, ran away, and was shot in the back.
Hmm.
And so my grandmother lost her dad when
Wow.
she was 7,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's just, so yeah, so that was recorded, right? But that had an impact upon how my grandma grew up,
Yeah. And which
right?
automatically
She
leads to
didn't.
how your mom and even you have grown up. Like, that gets passed down.
Yeah. So I didn't know. Now my yeah. So I didn't know. I only knew one of my great grandparents, his wife, Vincenza Domino. She died when I was 19, but I didn't know him.
Mm.
Right. His name was Giuseppe
Yeah.
Domino.
Wow.
And yeah. So it's yeah, those things. And it's interesting. I took when I was in grad school, or not grad school, when I was in law school. I actually took an entire course on called alternative. What is it? It's called. Was it called non-conventional? It was non-traditional aspects of the law, and I studied critical race theory, critical legal studies, and feminist jurisprudence. And this was 20 years ago, and it was before any of this became sort of publicly controversial. And so uh, I tend to hold the view. I mean, I am critical of those schools of thought. However, I do think that they are not without merit. That there is a lot to learn from those schools of thought, and I think you've alluded to it already, that there are aspects of our lives out of experience that some people don't understand. And I'll give you one it may sound like a weird one, but it's a political one. I am not politically progressive. I tend to be, slightly right of center in my politics, and I've been that way for quite some time. So when I got my first job at UNLV, one of my colleagues in the political science department was running for state senate, and she was being talked about at this party. It was a birthday party for one of my colleagues. And so a couple of us were just talking about the election, and one of them turned to me and said, "Oh, did you vote for Dina in the primary?" And I said, I couldn't. And they said, "Well, why couldn't you? Aren't you registered?" And I said, "No, I am registered to vote." "Well, what do you mean you couldn't? Were you did you miss the?" So it didn't occur to them that I was a Republican.
Right.
In other words, so that I couldn't, because I couldn't vote in the Democratic primary.
Right.
And so I actually thought about that, when I was first studying, kind of critical race theory stuff. In order for me to help myself understand it, I actually tried to think of examples of my own experience that helped illuminate it. And that was actually one that helped.
Yeah.
The sort of the assumptions that people make. And I remember I got to the point where one of my colleagues realized it, and he kind of got this kind of look of embarrassment. And I said, "No, it's okay." Now, of course, today things are a lot different in terms of the political makeup of the academy, but that was I think, it's not. I think there are things, that I think you're right, that you just simply can't appeal to the numbers. That there are ways in which we just make assumptions about the world that are maybe perfectly innocent, but we should be open to correction.
Yeah, and we keep coming back to that word reductionist, but I think it's very helpful. The last one, and I think this is a good thing to end on. I want to be respectful of your time, especially as we become a more globalized society. Your critique here of kind of this distinction between philosophy and religion, I think, is really interesting in terms of and I'm wading in deep waters that I don't fully understand here. This is not something I'm an expert in, but when you look at other cultures, they often don't distinguish between philosophy and religion the same way that we do. And when you talk about a moral tradition, that's a more, when you talk about Confucianism or you talk about Buddhism, Hinduism, these have these philosophical sides and these theological sides in ways that don't easily correspond. And if we're going to have these global discussions, we have to be able to account for and deal with our own division between philosophy and theology. Do you think that's a fair assessment? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a very good observation. I like to think of it in terms of, in the West, we've had this long tradition of church and state separation, right? Comes out of, it's always been there. Even when Europe was dominated by the Christian faith, there was always a kind of rivalry between, the princes and the kings and the bishops, right? They understood there were different jurisdictions.
Yeah.
There are a lot of cultures globally that don't have that, right? And so if you go to pre-Christian, if you go back to, let's say, the Greek philosophers, when Aristotle and Plato are writing, right? The idea that religious ideas can somehow be totally disentangled from the culture and society would have seemed almost absurd to them. And so I think we have to, when we're having discussions and dialogue with folks from other backgrounds, we shouldn't think, "Oh, this model that we have should be the kind of model for every society." There's maybe, I remember when the right after 9/11, there were several articles published online by scholars across the political spectrum suggesting that Islam should embrace a kind of post-Reformation Western view of church and state, or mosque and state. And, whether that, is even possible, I don't know. I'm not a scholar of Islam.
Yeah.
But there is this sense of, trying to sort of jerry rig other societies into our model
Hmm.
is unwise. And I think that doesn't mean that they can't appropriate or learn from us, and we can't learn from them. I mean, there's that kind of stuff you can't regulate.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the way the world is. But yeah, I mean, I think if you were to go, let's say, if you were to talk to someone from China and ask them, a question that assume this kind of division between religion and culture, they would find it almost incomprehensible.
Yeah.
It's not a way that most people have thought. And I wonder too whether we've always, at least in the United States, have had a kind of informal, theological tradition. I mean, a kind of
You referenced
quasi,
the moral tradition
yeah,
earlier, right?
yeah. So I think when you find, for example, in the early Republic of the United States, this, even though there was obviously great diversity of theological traditions, the diversity wasn't all that great, right? So people were divided between Presbyterians and Methodists and Baptists, and there were a few Catholics and a few Jewish citizens, but still there was this kind of common theism,
Right.
right?
Even the crazy ones, so to say, were deists, right?
Yeah, so the ones that were the most difficult were like the Quakers and the Mennonites, right? Because they were pacifists, and even that they were tough because we had to sort of find ways to get them as part of society, and we managed that. But as time has developed, or has the country, I mean, with the diversity now is even deeper, right? So the divisions now are not over these theological differences about, let's say, baptism and ecclesiology and maybe just war. Now it's over like the nature of man.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, there's a question about whether kind of conventional liberalism can handle that.
Yeah. Yeah. Any last words? Is there like a one solid takeaway? Besides read your book and to fully grasp your arguments, you walk through several important topics. But which, by the way, I love the titles of your book. I don't know how much effort you put into them, but like if that's just something you just come up with. But Taking Right Seriously, and then Never Doubt Thomas. I got a good chuckle out of those. So one, congratulations, they're great titles. But is there something you can leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, when it comes to religious conflict, I think it's important to sort of, especially if you're, let's say, skeptical of religion, kind of do yourself a favor. I mean, we're all kind of skeptical to some religion that's not ours, right? So even if you're, I mean, to sort of take the time to try to understand why people believe what they believe. I mean, really smart people believe this stuff. I mean, that's the thing that, you may, like, I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic. I have friends that are Protestants. I used to be a Protestant, but I have great respect for people that are, right? I don't think Protestantism is right, but I understand why someone would be one.
Right.
I think it's not and so I think we have to kind of, and we have to cultivate that in ourselves. It's a habit that we have to, and I think for that reason, it's a good idea to, talk to people and not just rely on, what you see on social media. It's and it's tough because we do kind of create our own epistemic bubbles, right? Where we don't allow, our own, we like to hear things that tickle our ears.
Yeah, absolutely. Great summary. Thank you, Dr. Beckwith. To our listeners, if you enjoyed the conversation, please like and share it, subscribe so that other people can be a part of this conversation as well. And just again, thank you.
Thank you.